There is a long, sad history of failed video game adaptations in both film and television, and I've always wondered why. Why does it seem to be so difficult to translate video games to other mediums? I mean, translating any story to another medium is always a challenge, whether that's Peter Jackson and his team translating the Lord of the Rings books to film, or M. Night Shyamalan translating a beloved animated show to film. It's never easy, but why specifically do video game adaptations fail? I think there's two main reasons. The first is that because of how far the technology of gaming has come, with many games having cinematics that mirror film and television, people can forget that they are still their own medium. They forget that video games are not movies, that video games are not television. Secondly, I think that a lot of filmmakers fail to realize, understand, and truly appreciate what made the game they're making into a movie or show great to begin with, what fans of that game loved so much about it. There's a separation there, a disconnect between filmmaker and game, because a lot of filmmakers who take on these projects seem to be uninterested in the games themselves. Gaming is not only a different medium for storytelling, it's also an entirely different industry with its own set of practices. Filmmaking and game making can have some overlap with things like motion capture, but by and large, they pretty much exist in two different spheres of entertainment. The problem is magnified with one aspect, the degrees of faithfulness to the game and the degree of deviation. And not just the degree of deviation, but the way it's done. Take The Adventures of John Master Cheeks, for instance. What a terrible adaptation of the Halo games. I almost threw up in my stomach just thinking about this show. The Halo show is like Applebee's. It's shit. Oops, still some left on the seat. The filmmakers working on the show specifically said that they haven't played the games and that they don't want to, so that they can make this show different from them. Which begs the question, if you want to make something different, then why not just simply make something different? Why hijack the Halo name and properties at all, other than for the obvious reason of also hijacking the audience of that franchise, which is not a good look. Deviation must be done with precision and clear intention. If you want to make something new, go make something new. Create a new story with new characters in a new setting that has nothing to do with any game. And if you do want to adapt a game, ask yourself why. Do you really like the game? Do you understand and appreciate what makes it great? Have you connected with its message, or has something indescribable about it resonated with you in ways you can't comprehend? If you want to make a game into something else only because of the game's established audience, then you are doing it for the wrong reasons. If you're going to make something so removed from the source material that, without the cosmetics, it's nearly unrecognizable, it again begs the question of why you chose to use the game's name at all. Tell the story of the game, spread the message, let it resonate with a wider audience that otherwise may not have encountered the story, otherwise leave it alone. That said, the Halo show is a good example of how not to adapt games for television, and through it, we can better appreciate HBO's The Last of Us. The Last of Us TV show has succeeded where many have failed in adapting a game. Even just within the first episode, it's made clear that this show is different from the other movies and shows that tried to take a popular game and transform it into something for a wider audience, which is ultimately the point in translating a game to film or television, to make it appeal to people who otherwise wouldn't have encountered the story. More than that, the point of a film or television adaptation is to make the story of the game reborn into a new body, meaning the spirit of the story lives on in a new format. The integrity of the adaptation is based primarily on that metrical alignment. The film or show that's attempting to translate the game must be rooted in the same soil. Otherwise, the integrity is lost, and the project ultimately fails to create a compelling narrative. So, how did The Last of Us do what others couldn't? Well, for one, the show shares a creator with the game. Neil Druckmann wrote and directed the game back in 2013, and the concept of the story began in his head, which means the original vision was kept alive by its creator. He keeps the show rooted in what made the game so special to begin with. He grounds the show in faithfulness, whereas Craig Mazin handles the project purely as a TV show, though he clearly has some deep appreciation for the game, and so he pushes the show forward into unfaithfulness. This balance has served the show well, and is perhaps the perfect combination. Knowing when to deviate and when to remain faithful is a huge part of adapting a story to any medium. The adaptation needs to demonstrate that it understands what I call the original magic that made the game special, and it needs to establish the philosophy that guides the original story. With The Last of Us, the show immediately establishes both an understanding of the original magic and the guiding philosophy. The opening of episode 1 depicts two scientists being interviewed on national television before a live 1960s studio audience. The interviewees are epidemiologists being asked what they think about the potential for another pandemic. One says that he fears viral infections to be the cause, but then the focus shifts to Dr. Newman.
All right, well, that's our show.
No, mankind has been at war with the virus from the start. Sometimes millions of people die, as in an actual war, but in the end, we always win.
But you, just to be clear, you do think microorganisms pose a threat?
Oh, in the most dire terms.
Bacteria?
No.
You like saying no?
Yes.
Not bacteria, not viruses, so...
Fungus. Yes, that's the usual response. Fungi seem harmless enough. Many species know otherwise, because there are some fungi who seek not to kill, but to control. Let me ask you, where do we get LSD from?
Where do you get it from?
It comes from ergot, a fungus. Psilocybin, also a fungus. Viruses can make us ill, but fungi can alter our very minds. There's a fungus that infects insects, gets inside an ant, for example, travels through its circulatory system to the ant's brain, and then floods it with hallucinogens, thus bending the ant's mind to its will. The fungus starts to direct the ant's behavior, telling it where to go, what to do, like a puppeteer with a marionette. And it gets worse. The fungus needs food to live, so it begins to devour its host from within, replacing the ant's flesh with its own. But it doesn't let its victim die, no. It keeps its puppet alive by preventing decomposition. How? Where do we get penicillin from?
Fungus.
Opening the show with an interview with two scientists from the 1960s is ingenious for a couple of reasons. For one, it establishes an important undertone that colors the rest of the series. That what has happened with the cordyceps infection is grounded in some sort of possible reality. Infusing the show with a sense of realism brings out the true meaning of horror. Let me explain. The scariest movie I've ever seen is 2012. Why? Because when I first watched it, I thought it was real. Not that I was watching real-life events play out, but that what was being depicted in the movie was a quickly approaching disaster that would mark the true end of the world. Being raised evangelical Christian, 2012 was a warning sign, a harbinger of things to come. It terrified me. I've never been so frightened while watching a movie. Looking back, now that I have come out of those beliefs that I was raised with, the movie isn't scary at all. It's just a dumb blockbuster action movie. What created the horror was the sense of realism. For another example, supernatural horror movies were always so terrifying to me because I was raised to believe in demons and demonic possession. I was told that real demons could enter your home and even your body if you watch horror movies, and that when you're watching this type of media, you're opening a very real door to the world of the demonic. This made supernatural horror movies so much more scary. So grounding your horror in realism is the most effective way to get audiences to take it seriously and to actually be scared by it, to give that chill down your spine, the spiral of thoughts that creep in when you're most isolated, laying in bed at night, walking home by yourself through a dark alley, going to your car in a parking garage. The little moments of panic when you hear something unexplained and you think back to the movie or show you watched the night before. That's the true essence of horror. It taps into the most basic, fundamental, and oldest emotional response we have: fear. further rooted into people's psyche by a touch of believability. Even just a tad of, no. But could it? Is that actually possible? The second way this opening is ingenious is that it creates a foundational layer of the threat of infections and pandemics through a social lens. We see that even in the 60s, people worried about the next big outbreak. Apocalyptic stories existed back then, but they often focused on the great frontier of fiction at the time, space. Alien invasions and weird dystopian nightmares were huge back then. Infectious disease left a bitter taste in many people's mouths after the polio outbreak, and 2 influenza pandemics left thousands dead and hundreds more changed forever. So the use of infections in fiction wasn't nearly as heavy as it is today, but the possibility of a viral or bacterial pandemic still rang through the pages of many a novel, from 1947's The Plague to 1949's Earth Abides, and 1954's I Am Legend, and of course, 1969's The Andromeda Strain. People still had a fear and an interest in this genre. See, I think the thesis of any good apocalyptic story is based around fear, usually shrouded in some kind of mystery or a seemingly unstoppable force that creates existential dread, while also grounding the story with a tale of raw humanity and what we ought to do with the time that is given to us, how we must hold tight to those we love, as well as exploring what it takes to maintain your humanity in a fallen world, what it takes to survive. Some stories go even further and illustrate what it means to survive. Is survival just breathing, or is it being alive in a more philosophical sense? No apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic story I've ever read, played, or watched has ever been good or impactful without these things. This genre explores what it means to be human at a very foundational level. This prologue plants the seeds for this premise masterfully. To see the fear in both the audience and the interviewer as the threat of a fungal pandemic is described in brutal detail, it's chilling. And in the prologue of episode 2, when the mycologist says to bomb the city and everyone in it, I got chills again. That was also very well done. It was a look not into what humanity ought to do in the face of potential extinction, but what it can do, perhaps the only option that may be afforded to us. It's another masterfully planted seed that, together with episode 1's prologue, is ever present throughout the show as a hovering shadow that reminds us of the world before the fall. Within the first chapter of the show, we have our first deviation. In the game, we spend very little time with Joel and Sarah, but in the show, we spend considerably more. We're shown a very usual morning and get a peek into Joel and Sarah's bond as father and daughter. In the game, our time with Joel and Sarah is the prologue, but in the show, the TV interview serves as the prologue, and our time with Joel and Sarah is the first chapter, so it gets to breathe a little more. And how does it make use of this time? By showing us what matters most. Not just what Sarah's father means to her, but what Joel's daughter means to him. The light in the darkness that she was. She was bright in more than one way. She was caring, compassionate, empathetic, loving. There wasn't anything she wouldn't do for the ones she cared for. Even being raised in an uncaring world, whose blade was further sharpened by the outbreak, she found a way to combat the darkness. Though it was ultimately the sword of that darkened world that struck her down. In my video essay on The Last of Us game, I mentioned how the infection has no place for our children in its heart, that it only knows to suffocate, grow, and consume. In Sarah's death, we see how even a soldier may have no place for our children in his heart, that we, same as the cordyceps, are capable of suffocating and consuming the world set before us. Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey being cast as Joel and Ellie wasn't received too well, generally speaking. Their work in Game of Thrones preceded them, and some fans welcomed them with open arms from the get-go, but I was hesitant. I didn't know if they could really pull it off, but boy was I wrong. They are brilliant together. Their chemistry is strong, and they dissolved into their roles so expertly that I easily bought them as Joel and Ellie. The moment Bella sold me as Ellie was her reaction to Henry's death. That jolt, how she mourned Sam with unspoken tears. It was amazing. Joel, of course, sold me when Sarah died in his arms. and we didn't get the cries of Troy Baker's performance, but instead got a cold and empty silence as he picks up his daughter and holds her. Troy Baker did that as Joel too, but the look in Pedro's eyes, the tight grip he has, it sold me. It took me, in a sense. I was now watching The Last of Us. Bill and Frank's episode illustrates the philosophy underlining the story. It deviates a lot from the game, but with a purpose. A lot of people see episode 3 as filler, but they couldn't be more wrong. Although they are side characters, they're important to the theme of the story. Love, what we fight for, what we survive for, who gives meaning to our prolonged existence. We're using all these supplies to stay alive, but what are we staying alive for? What could Joel's life look like if he allows love to come back into his life? Only not romantic love, but fatherly love. That is the point so beautifully illustrated in this episode. The philosophy kept rooted in the soil of the game by Neil Druckmann blossoms here in this bittersweet love story, and the fruits of this blossoming are eventually harvested by our main characters near the conclusion of the season. Bill's letter to Joel, I think, begins to put things into perspective. It plants something in his mind that stays with him to the bittersweet end of his journey to get Ellie to the Fireflies.
What?
It's all right. You're with me. Take it slow. The drugs are still wearing off.
I was with the Fireflies, and then... What drugs?
The Infected presented another chance for the show to deviate negatively from the game. Overusing them wouldn't have taken much, but I think the show struck a good balance here. In the game, the Infected are used for two purposes: obstacles, or enemies in the game, and monsters. Gameplay enemies are obviously not needed here, so the show doesn't require them to be that. All it requires them to be are the monsters. So a good director uses their monster thoughtfully, with full intent, giving their audience only small glimpses of the monster until the story has reached what I call the point of no return, in which the monster is fully exposed and the audience, and usually the characters, can no longer live in bittersweet ignorance. The shadows, creaks, and other little noises harmoniously ignite into a loud bang. The way we are led to the moment the clickers are fully exposed is done with such artistic craftsmanship. It's so fine-tuned, showing us a victim of clickers. The expression on Joel and Tess's face as they know good and well what did this while Ellie is unaware. How each noise, the creaking of the stairs, dust falling from the ceiling, puts us further and further on edge. After a painful climb to the top, we are met with relief. There are no clickers after all. But then, that sound, the clicking. It starts small, like raindrops falling from a cloud before the storm. Notice the looks on the characters' faces when they hear that sound, especially Joel and Tess. How you can really sell your monster to your audience is through how the characters react to it, the look of fear in their eyes. It makes empathizing with that fear seamless. I think the Infected were used well overall. I was hoping that they wouldn't be overused, so I was happy with how they were incorporated only when necessary. Episodes like Left Behind stick more strictly to the source material, and it's also done with a purpose. Changing this crucial part of Ellie's backstory wouldn't have been the right choice, because of its importance to Ellie's character arc, to the moment she thinks about leaving Joel behind, but then remembers the time she and Riley held each other close, even when all seemed lost, when they refused to leave each other, and how she was ultimately forced to leave Riley behind. This follows the game's DLC pretty closely. There are a few differences, especially in its presentation. The great wonders of the mall is a sentimental, endearing, and adventurous way to experience the mall through Ellie's eyes. As someone who has never been to a mall before the fall of civilization, Ellie finds joy in these tiny things that most people wouldn't give a second thought. The episode does well with showing us the last moments of pure childhood that Ellie and Riley get to experience, as this episode details the death of innocence. As much as they want to live in this fantasy world of bliss that they've created inside the mall, the reality of the world still finds a way to creep in. A lot of people also thought that this episode was filler, and I don't know if these people just aren't clicking with the show, no pun intended, as many of these same people said the same thing about episode 3, or if storytelling just isn't their strong suit. Left Behind is crucial to Ellie's character arc, magnified by the situation in which she finds herself at the time it's introduced. The decision to not leave Joel behind, but instead take on the mindset of Riley when she said, "Whether it's 2 minutes or 2 days, we don't give that up," is given weight through Ellie's lens only through the context of what we're shown in this episode, along with the burden she carries by the end of the series when her immunity is unable to produce a cure. It's anything but filler, and it was beautiful. I think the biggest way that this show succeeds is not what it was faithful to in regards to the game, but in what ways it deviated. The ways it was unafraid to be different, while remaining faithful to the source material, to the thought experiment of Joel and Ellie's journey. It took chances on adding elements that at times recontextualize the moment, such as making Sam deaf. It's subtle, but it adds a layer of vulnerability that somehow forges an even greater tragedy. Seeing Sam and Henry communicate through sign language, which implies that Henry learned sign language just so that he could communicate with his little brother. That reinforces their bond. There are subtle changes like this spread throughout the show. It's daring, it dares to be different, and I would argue that the show is all the better for it.